The tannery smoke came down in greasy layers, and the iron railing under Mara Reed's glove was cold enough to sting through the cloth. Below her, canal water slid black and slow between stone walls, carrying the stink of hide, coal dust, and old rain. Somewhere deeper in the yard, a bell clanged once, then got swallowed by the city. Mara had grown up where the world froze hard and stayed honest about it. In the lake country, her only company had been a near-silent marsh trapper who taught her how to read ice by sound, how to place a foot so a crust wouldn't give, how to work a snare without wasting motion. He spoke to her the way some men handle knives, carefully, only when it mattered. And he had made one rule plain over and over until it lived in her bones. Keep the snare-and-ice craft for weather, beasts, and survival. Never turn it on people. So she came to the city with that rule still intact, at least on paper. Night shift at the tannery. No questions, no trouble. Just a narrow bed in a boarding house that smelled like boiled cabbage and wet wool, and a wage that was supposed to be enough to keep her fed. But the place was rotten with pressure. Men got paid late. Dock workers came in with split knuckles and empty eyes, and every few nights the foreman's books somehow left everyone short. The money disappeared into the canal district, where the Weltz brothers owned the docks, the towpaths, the weirs, and most of the fear that moved through the neighborhood. Mara saw their machine before she ever saw their faces. It was in the way workers lowered their eyes when a black coat passed, in the way the canal warden nodded before anyone spoke, in the way the men on the loading platforms stood like they were guarding a throne instead of a job. The brothers didn't need to shout. They just had to let people know they were watching. That was enough to make the whole waterfront fold in on itself. By dusk, the city had turned the color of dirty steel. Mara stepped out along the canal path after her shift, shoulders tight under her coat, one hand on the strap of her bag. Ahead, the iced weir crossed the water like a pale scar, glazed over from the week's hard frost. It looked solid if you didn't know what you were seeing. She knew better. Thin water under a skin of ice. Bad footing. Bad place for a fight. That was exactly where the brothers waited. 2 men first, then more in the shadows beyond them, all heavy boots and dock smoke, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being punished. They didn't rush her. They let the silence stretch, expecting it to bend her first. One of them smiled like he'd already won. Mara stopped where the ice changed pitch under her heel and lifted her chin just enough to look past them, not at them. For a moment, nobody moved. Just the canal water breathing under the crust, the tannery chimneys coughing behind her, and that bad, thin ice holding all of them like it was deciding who to keep. If you want the next part, subscribe and stay close. The first man took a step onto the glazed span, and the ice answered under his boot with a hard, hollow click. Mara heard it. Of course she did. She'd spent her whole life listening for that kind of lie in the ground. The one in front of her smiled again, thin and ugly, then spread his hands like he was being generous. "Bag," he said, "then you walk away." Behind him, the other men fanned out just enough to block the bank, but not enough to look nervous. They thought they were done with her already. Thought the quiet was fear, and the stillness was surrender. The canal smelled like oil, rust, and cold stone. A tram clanged somewhere far off, and the sound rolled across the water like a dull warning. Mara let the pause sit between them. Then she shifted one foot half a pace to the left, and the man nearest the edge copied her without thinking. That was the first mistake. In the marsh, people always gave themselves away by trying to match a rhythm they didn't understand. "You shouldn't stand there," she said. One of the brothers laughed under his breath, a laugh because he wanted the others to hear he wasn't worried. The heavier one, broad in the shoulders with a scar across his chin, started forward. Mara saw the weight in his hips before she saw the movement in his feet. He was coming to grab, not to test. Close enough to overpower, close enough to make it look easy. She waited until his heel touched the weakest strip. Then she moved. It wasn't a rush. It was a clean step off the line, a turn of the shoulder, and a sharp pull at the man's wrist when he reached for her sleeve. His own momentum dragged him sideways. He slammed into the rail hard enough to rattle the chain, and the chain was old, patched, half frozen. The sound went through the weir like a crack running under glass. The second brother lunged in too fast, trying to catch her before she could reset. Mara dropped her center of gravity and let him run into empty air. His boots skidded on the frost film, and she hooked his ankle with the edge of her heel. He went down on one knee, then both, and his hands slapped the ice to save himself. That was worse. The ice flexed under the sudden pressure. Not much, just enough. The heavy one cursed and tried to wrench free, but his arm was bent wrong now, pinned tight against the rail. Mara twisted once, just enough to make him howl, and his grip opened. No knife came out. No blade flashed. There was no need. Her hands were faster than his anger, and the wet cold made every movement ugly and slow for him. In less than a breath, he was folded over the railing, face white, teeth clenched, one shoulder hanging useless. The second brother got upright too fast and slipped again. Mara struck his knee from the side, not hard enough to break it, just hard enough to steel the leg. He hit the ice on one hand, and the skin split against the rough frost. Blood spotted the white surface. For the first time, the confidence went out of all of them. A young woman raised by a near-silent marsh trapper in a frozen lake and reed wilderness, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice survival craft off other people, stood in the middle of their little roadblock and watched the men recalculate her. That was the moment they stopped seeing a girl and started seeing a problem. The scarred one tried to swing at her with his free arm. Mara ducked under it, stepped in close, and used his own body to turn him away from the bank. Another half step, another shift of weight, and the man's boots slid to the very edge where the ice thinned into black water beneath the skin. He felt it. She saw it in his face. He froze. That was enough. Mara released him and backed off before the whole span collapsed under all of them. The surviving brother stared at her with his mouth open, breathing hard, one hand cradling the wrist she'd twisted. No weapon, no clean strike, just two men bent and shaking on a canal crossing that had looked safe a minute ago. Then, from somewhere beyond the lamps, a whistle blew twice. Short, official. Mara turned her head a fraction. On the far side of the canal, under the soot-stained arch by the warehouse steps, the canal warden stood with his cap low and his hands in his coat pockets, watching the whole thing like he'd been waiting for the right moment to decide who was guilty. And the brother on the ice looked past her, saw him too, and smiled, because now he had a lie he could use. The warden's little whistle of power followed Mara all the way off the bridge. It was the sort of sound that didn't need volume. It just needed people to obey it. She kept walking anyway, boots scraping frost from the stone, and the brother behind her let her go, because the lie had already started doing its work. By the time she reached the tannery yard, the air had thickened into that sour, wet heat again. Lime, smoke, old hides, wet ash. The foreman was waiting by the ledger table with his sleeves rolled up and his mouth tight. He didn't even pretend not to know. "Canal office called," he said. "Says you started trouble on their crossing. Says you stole from dock men. I'm not getting dragged into it." He slid the wage sheet away from her hand before she could touch it. Not torn up, just withheld. A neat little punishment. Mara looked at the stamp in the corner, then at the foreman's shoes, caked with the same gray grit as everybody else's. He wasn't brave enough to fight them. He was just the kind of man who survived by stepping aside fast. A young woman raised by a near-silent marsh trapper in a frozen lake and reed wilderness, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice survival craft off other people, stood under the tannery lamps and watched a city decide she was easier to blame than the men who bled it dry. The others in the room heard enough to keep their eyes down. One girl at the soaking vats made a quick sign against bad luck. A loader with a split lip muttered that dock men never came alone, and then he went back to work like that was the end of it. That was the part the city loved most. Not the beating, the silence after. Mara took the ledger sheet back only after the foreman let go. Her fingers stayed calm. Her face stayed still, but the old lessons moved under her skin, sharp and useful. When people lied in the marsh, they left marks. Broken reeds, shifted mud, a changed line of drag. The city was no different. It just dressed the marks in ink and seals. At the yard gate, 2 dockmen were smoking under the lamp, shoulders hunched in their coats. They weren't there by accident. They watched her leave, then watched her keep leaving, like they wanted her to know the road back was being measured. She did not go home first. Instead, she cut through the service lane behind the tannery and followed the canal stink toward the offices near the docks. The pavement there was slick with spilled brine and horse piss, and the windows glowed yellow through their soot. She passed a notice board nailed to a post, and there it was, her name, scrawled under a theft report, with the canal warden's seal pressed beside it in red wax. So that was the shape of the thing, a net. At the boarding house, the landlady handed Mara a folded paper without looking up from her knitting. No words, just the paper and a quick glance toward the stairwell. Mara climbed with the note in her fist, every plank complaining under her boots. Her room was still shut, but the latch sat crooked now, and the air inside had that ugly turned-over smell of someone else's hands. She didn't rush. She checked the corners first, then the bed, then the wash basin. Only one thing was gone. The small reed whistle Silas had carved for her when she was 13, the one he said was useless unless you knew how to listen for the right answer. On the pillow lay a canal token, blackened with dock tar, and pinned under it, half bent from the pressure, was another paper. One line, one address. The canal office wanted her there at dawn. Mara looked at the seal, then at the smear of wet tar on the corner, and slowly closed her hand around the note. By dawn, the canal district had gone gray and slick, with mist sitting low over the stone like spilled milk. Mara walked toward the address on the paper with the note folded tight in her pocket, and every block felt narrower than the last. Dock chains clinked somewhere behind shuttered windows. A horse blew warm breath into the cold and stamped once on the cobbles. The whole place smelled like wet rope, soot, and old river mud. The canal office stood above the water on blackened pilings, with a narrow stair and a door painted so many times the grain showed through. 2 men were smoking on the landing. One of them had the same heavy shoulders as the brother on the bridge. The other wore a brown coat and a badge on a chain. Not the police kind, but the kind people accepted because they were tired of arguing. The bought canal warden. He looked at Mara like he already had a place for her in a file. Inside, the office was warm in a dead way, with a stove ticking and damp wool hanging from hooks. A clerk with ink on his cuff pretended not to notice her. The warden sat behind a desk with a ledger open and a strip of red wax on a tray beside it. On the wall, a map of the docks had grease marks, tally lines, and one narrow corridor down toward the marsh flats. Someone had marked it twice in blue chalk. Mara saw that before she saw the men. The surviving brother was there, one hand wrapped in dirty linen, face pale under the eye sockets, playing the hurt man so hard it almost worked. He didn't look at her at first. He looked at the warden, then at the ledger, as if this whole room existed to confirm what he already wanted true. "This is her," he said finally. His voice was rough from pain, but the fear in it was careful. "The one who attacked us on the crossing." Mara set the paper down on the desk. "You called me here." The warden's mouth moved a little, not a smile. "You'd do well to speak when spoken to." That was when she understood the room. The office was a machine for turning lies into paper. She had seen that trick before, just in a different shape. In the marsh, a trap could look like a path if you didn't study the mud. Here, it looked like law. The brother finally lifted his eyes. They were flat now, not angry, certain. He had brought the warden, the clerk, and the file books because he didn't need to beat her again. He only needed her standing in the wrong place when the story got written. "She's a thief," he said. "Took dock wages, took from my men." Mara didn't answer. She just let her gaze drift to the desk, where her reed whistle sat beside the ledger, the black tar on the token still damp enough to shine. They had kept it, or maybe they wanted her to know they had. That tiny piece of wood looked wrong in the office, like a bone on polished wood. The warden followed her eyes and tapped the desk once with 2 fingers. "Confiscated property," he said. "Anything else that belongs to you is likely to be searched for next." Mara felt the old lesson rise in her chest, the one Silas never said twice. Don't fight the first trap, find the second one. Her snare-and-ice craft had taught her that every surface told on itself if you stood still long enough. The brothers were not just pressing her, they were pushing her toward the edge of the city, where the ground turned soft and ugly, where the marsh began to breathe under the crust. And now she saw why. On the wall map, just beyond the last dock marker, a section of low wetland had been boxed in charcoal. Beside it, in the warden's hand, a single word had been written so lightly it could almost be missed. Access. Mara looked at the chalk line, then at the warden, then at the brother with the bandaged hand. None of them were looking at the map anymore. They were watching her face, waiting for fear to show. And when it didn't, the clerk at the side desk quietly stood up and locked the office door from the inside. The door stayed shut, and the little office went quiet enough for the stove to tick. Mara didn't move at first. She let the silence stretch, just like Silas taught her. In the marsh, if a trap was hidden, the wrong kind of hurry killed you. In the city, it was the same. The brother with the bandaged hand stood by the desk, watching her like he expected the fear to come later. The warden kept one palm flat on the ledger, pinning it in place. The clerk held the key ring low by his thigh, pretending he wasn't part of this at all. Mara looked past them, not at them. The wall map was closer now, and the blue chalk line had been drawn with a fresh, heavy hand. It cut from the last dock gate into the low wetland at the city edge, then bent toward a strip of reed marsh the paper called Dead Ground. There were 2 other marks beside it. One was a simple X. The other was a date written for dawn. That told her enough. Mara, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice craft off other people, stood in a locked canal office and watched the shape of the hunt become clearer by the second. They had brought her here to keep her in place while the rest of the machine started moving. The brother with the bandaged hand finally spoke again. "You can make this easy." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and set it on the desk, but he didn't slide it toward her. He made her look at it first. There was a line of language on the page, all stiff and official, the kind that tried to sound clean while doing dirty work. Mara didn't read the whole thing. She didn't need to. The black wax seal at the bottom matched the one on the notice at the boarding house. "Sign," the warden said. Mara let her eyes drift to the reed whistle on the desk. It had been polished clean, but the cord loop was still frayed where Silas had tied it years ago. She could see the notch in the wood, the little nick on the side from the winter he carved it by the stove while the lake froze outside. Somebody had handled it roughly. Somebody had wanted it to feel like evidence, not memory. She looked back up. "If I sign, what then?" The warden gave a small shrug. "Then you stop making a nuisance of yourself." The brother with the bandaged hand made a soft, ugly sound through his nose. "Then we stop talking about the crossing." There it was, the story after the fight. He wanted her ashamed, cornered, and late. He wanted her to believe the city could name her first and punish her second. But the room had already told on itself. The map, the key ring, the wet smell coming from the clerk's boots, fresh mud still packed in the seams. Somebody had come in off the low ground just before she arrived. Mara shifted her weight a fraction and watched every man in the room track the movement without meaning to. Predators always did that. They watched the feet first. "Who's going out there?" she asked. The clerk swallowed. The warden's fingers tightened on the ledger. Nobody answered, and that was answer enough. Mara lifted the paper with 2 fingers, just enough to read the top line. A transfer order. Dock crew, Western Cordon, 2 wagons, dawn. Her eyes went still. So they weren't only building a lie around her. They were sending men into the wet edge before sunrise, into the same dead ground she'd already marked in her head. The brother saw the look change and smiled, thin and mean. Now you understand. Mara folded the paper once and set it back down. Then she finally reached for the whistle. The clerk twitched, but too late. Her sleeve covered her hand, and the small carved wood vanished against her wrist. Outside the locked door, somewhere down the hall, boots started moving in a hurry. Not one pair, several. And from the window glass, in the gray reflection behind the warden's shoulder, Mara caught the shape of a second man entering the corridor with a long coat and a dock baton. The second set of boots in the corridor changed everything. Mara kept still, but only for a breath. The door was locked, the clerk was sweating, and the brother with the bandaged hand had shifted his weight like a man expecting backup. She didn't look at the lock. She looked at the room. Chair legs, stove heat, the thin brass lamp on the desk, the frame of the window painted shut from years of soot and damp. In the marsh, you didn't stare at the snare. You watched the ground around it. The warden followed her eyes and tightened his mouth. Don't try anything. Mara stood in a locked canal office and judged 3 men by how badly they wanted her afraid. They had made one mistake already. They thought a door was the same thing as control. The boots in the hall stopped outside. A knuckle rapped once against the wood. Then again, harder. The warden crossed to the door and cracked it open just enough to speak through the gap. Mara saw the edge of a long coat, dark wool, wet at the hem. Dock baton in one hand. Not police. Another yard man, the kind who carried messages for men who didn't want to come in person. The brother with the bandaged hand turned his head at once, and for the first time he looked unsure. That told her the outside was already moving. The clerk fumbled the key ring, dropped it, and cursed under his breath. Mara bent first, not because she needed the keys, but because people always forgot the floor. While his eyes dropped, she slid her foot under the desk and hooked the chair leg. One small pull. The chair shifted a few inches, enough to make the clerk step back to steady it. He bumped the stovepipe and hissed in pain. That was all the opening she needed. Mara drove the desk lamp sideways with her wrist. Glass struck wood. Oil sloshed. Lamp flame jumped, and the room lit hard and uneven for a second. A dirty yellow flash over the map, the ledger, and the wet shine on the warden's face. The brother lunged on instinct, not at her first, at the whistle in her hand. So he knew what it was. She slipped away from the desk edge, took one quick step to the side, and let him overcommit. His shoulder clipped the chair tipped, and his bad hand hit the desk with a sound like a hammer on meat. The warden snapped, "Stop her!" But he said it too late, and now the room had changed shape. The clerk backed toward the window. The messenger in the hall started to push in. Everybody had lost their clean lines. Mara felt the old marsh logic settle into place. Separate the weight, pull the strongest foot off the stable ground, make them decide too fast. She grabbed the map from the wall in one tear of paper and threw it into the stove. Flames licked the edge at once. Smoke curled up thick and black, ugly and useful. The warden cursed and swiped at it, and in that instant she used the desk itself, planting one hand, swinging low, and kicking the chair into the messenger's knees as he came through the doorway. He went down hard, baton spinning across the hall. Then she was past him. The corridor smelled like wet plaster and lamp oil. Her boots struck the plank floor once, twice, then the stair rail under her palm. Behind her, the brother shouted for someone to seal the back exit, and the warden's voice cracked for the first time. Not anger, panic. Mara hit the landing, saw the side door, and nearly smiled. The latch was old, iron on warped wood. She twisted it with the flat of her hand and slipped through into the alley behind the office, where the air was colder and sharp with canal water. Across the service lane, under the gray light, stood a wagon with wet mud on the wheels and marsh grass caught in the spokes. Someone had already been to the edge, and tied to the wagon rail, swaying in the wind, was the missing reed whistle's twin. The whistle tied to the wagon rail gave one soft turn in the wind, and Mara saw at once that it wasn't the one from her pocket. Same cut of wood, same reed cord, same hand. Silas had made a pair years ago, saying one was for her and one was for the day she needed to find him in bad weather. She had never told anyone about it. Now the second one sat in plain sight, damp from the morning mist. The alley behind the canal office was narrow and filthy, packed with old ash, broken crates, and a black runoff ditch that stank like a dead fish left in a bucket. Mara crouched beside the wagon wheel and touched the whistle only with her eyes. Somebody had put it there on purpose. Somebody wanted her to know they had been on the marsh edge already, following her home. Mara stood in a city alley and watched proof that the hunt had moved beyond the docks. She cut the whistle down in one clean motion, slipped the cord into her sleeve, and kept moving. The wagon tracks in the mud were fresh, not a full load, but enough weight to sink the ruts deep. The wheels had come from the canal road and turned off toward the low warehouses at the western cordon. That was the direction the map had marked. That was where the brother in the office had been looking too. The whole thing had been set in motion before dawn, and now she could feel the shape of it tightening. At the corner, she paused beside a shuttered fish seller's stall and listened. 2 men, maybe 3, on the far side of the lane, boots on wet stone. The kind of step that tries to be casual and fails. She kept her face down and adjusted the strap of her bag as if she were only another worker trying to get home. One of the men passed the mouth of the alley without seeing her. Another lingered long enough to spit into the gutter. Their breath smelled of cheap tobacco and river cold. They were looking for a girl in a panic. Mara gave them none. Instead, she crossed the service road and ducked under a hanging awning that dripped canal water onto her shoulders. From there, she could see the western lane lead out toward the low bog flats. The city ended ugly there. Brick gave way to collapsed fencing, then to reed growth jammed against the flood banks. A place half claimed by water, half forgotten by men. It was ugly ground for a chase, and that was why they would use it. She knew the mind behind the net now, not just the brothers, the warden, maybe more. Someone had put a second whistle on the wagon because they wanted her to follow it, or wanted her to be followed. The thought sat cold in her chest, but it did not shake her. Across the lane, a boy no older than 16 came out of a doorway with a crate on his shoulder and nearly collided with her. He caught himself, glanced at her face, then at the whistle cord disappearing into her sleeve. His eyes widened. Mara saw the recognition hit him, fast and stupid. He knew what she was, not by name, by rumor. That was enough to matter. He turned too quickly to look behind him, and she was already gone by the time his mouth opened. She cut through a gap between buildings, brushed past a stack of oil tins, and came out beside the western access road, just as a dock wagon rolled through the fog toward the flats. Mud on the wheels, tar on the boards. 2 men walking behind it with their hands inside their coats. The second whistle was no accident. Mara watched the wagon disappear into the gray and started after it at a distance, her breathing slow, her steps quiet, her old marsh patience settling over her like a wet coat. The first trap had been at the canal office. This one was moving. And somewhere beyond the reeds, just beyond the city's last fence line, the bog was waiting with its mouth open. Mara kept the wagon in sight by using the buildings, not the road. She moved from shadow to shadow along the western edge of the district, where brick gave way to rusted sheet metal and the air turned wet again with drainage from the canal banks. The wheel ruts she'd found were still fresh, dark cuts through the mud, and the smell that followed them was wrong for a city street. Reed rot, peat water, cold marsh. The wagon slowed near a half-collapsed sluice shed with one wall missing and the roof sagging under old snow. Two men climbed down. One carried a lantern wrapped in cloth, the other a bundle of narrow planks. Not dock work, not normal hauling either. They were laying a path where no path should have been. Mara crouched behind a blackberry hedge gone wild along the fence line and watched them measure the ground with their boots. A young woman, raised by a near-silent marsh trapper in a frozen lake and reed wilderness, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice craft off other people, stood in a weed-choked ditch and watched strangers handle the edge of the bog like they owned it. The first man hammered a short stake into the mud beside the shed and tied a strip of white cloth to it, a marker for visibility, so men behind him could keep distance in fog. She recognized the trick at once. Silas used to do the same thing on whiteout ice, but only when he was leading a line through bad weather. These men were doing it for a chase. She moved closer, slow enough that the fence wire never sang. A second wagon sat behind the shed, this one unloaded, its bed carrying jugs of lamp oil, 2 coils of rope, and a crate of iron hooks. More men were working there, not speaking much. One wore a brown coat like the canal wardens, though newer and cleaner, which meant money had touched it recently. Another had his collar up against the wind and kept checking the alley mouth every few seconds. They were building for her. That should have made her angry. Instead, it made her calm. Anger came after the ground was understood. Right now, she needed the shape. The men were not wandering. They were staging. The shed sat at the exact bend where the hard road died and the marsh began. From there, the route split into 3 ways, one toward the reed flats, one toward the pumping channel, one straight out to the open bog that the city map had politely left blank. Mara crouched lower and listened. "Warden says she'll bite," one of the men muttered. "Then keep the oil dry," said another. "We only need her out far enough." He said it like a joke, but his voice was tight. That told her they were scared of something beyond her. Not enough to stop, just enough to hate the job. She let them keep talking. A man who thinks he's safe talks too much. The third voice came from inside the shed, low and rough, and it stopped her cold for half a second. Not a brother, not the warden. Someone else, older, more patient. "If she's half what they said on the crossing," he said, "then don't box her in. Push her where the ground lies. Let the bog do the rest." Mara's hand tightened on the fence wire. That was the first time she'd heard anyone in this city speak about the marsh like they knew it. Not as land, as a weapon. She eased back into the weeds before the lantern turned her way. There would be more men coming. Not tonight, maybe, but soon. The wagon had been the leash. The shed was the collar. And somewhere between the two, somebody had decided the hunt was already theirs. Mara looked once more at the white strip tied to the stake, then at the dark line of reeds beyond the broken fence. The next time they came out here, they would not be the ones choosing the route. Mara kept the wagon in sight by staying where the ground lied least. Brick walls gave her cover, then a rusted fence, then a strip of reeds bent low under the wind. The men at the shed had not been idle for long. They were laying white cloth strips on short stakes, spacing them out in a line that vanished into the foggy flats. A corridor. The 2 dock men moved with the same ugly certainty she had seen on the weir. One carried rope, the other the iron hooks. A third kept to the back, checking the marsh road every few seconds, as if he expected somebody else to arrive. The smell told her more than their voices did. Lamp oil, wet leather, and peat water rising through the cold crust. It was the smell of work being turned into a weapon. Mara, raised by a near-silent marsh trapper in a frozen lake and reed wilderness, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice craft off other people, watched strangers turn the edge of the bog into a trap line, and knew they were building it for a body that had not yet shown itself. She dropped into a drainage ditch and moved under the broken edge of the fence until she reached a gap in the reeds where the marsh opened like a dark mouth. From there, she could hear them more clearly. One man laughed once, then cut himself off. Another said the oil had to stay dry. Then that older voice from inside the shed, calm and flat, came back again. "Don't crowd her," it said. "The ground will do the rest." Mara stared through the reed heads at the black sheet of water hidden under a skin of frost. Rotten bog ice, thin enough to hold a boot if a man moved right, thin enough to drop him if he shifted wrong. She tested the edge with a reed stem, felt it tremble, then break through with no sound at all. That was the dangerous part. The ice didn't shout when it failed. It just gave up. She marked the weak line with a bent reed and kept going. On the far side of the shed, half buried in rush grass, sat a second wagon with new wheel tracks leading in from the city road. The mud around it was churned up by more boots than the first one. That meant more men were coming, maybe tonight, maybe before dawn. And one of the prints beside the rear wheel had a sharp heel and a straight edge she recognized from the canal office. The warden had sent his own feet out here. Mara circled the back of the shed and found the sideboard unlatched. Inside, the air was close and stale, full of rope fiber and wet wood. The map she'd seen in the office was spread flat on a table under a lantern. This one marked heavier, with black charcoal lines crossing the bog flats and a crude circle around the old pumping channel. Beside it lay a stack of wage ledgers and a tin box of seal stamps. The same machine, just moved farther out into the mud. She heard footsteps outside, close now. Not the dock men, the lighter, careful steps of the warden's coat. He was speaking to somebody in low tones, and only one word came through the wall clear enough to catch. "Alive." Mara slid down into the sump pit at the base of the wall and pressed herself into the dark while the footsteps stopped on the boards above her. The room smelled of iron and old water. Her hand closed around a loose coil of rope, and she smiled once, small and cold, because now she could see it. They were not waiting for her in the marsh. They were trying to steer her into it. And when the board above her creaked again, she heard a second voice outside the shed say her name. Mara held her breath as the board above her creaked again. Then she moved. The sump pit was narrow, wet, and cold enough to bite through her coat, but it gave her what the room did not, a blind corner. She came up behind the work table in one quick push, one hand already closing around the loose rope coil, the other sweeping for the lantern. The man standing nearest the table never got a full turn. Her shoulder hit his ribs, the lantern flew, and hot oil sprayed across the boards. He staggered, cursing, and the older voice at the wall snapped, "Down!" Too late. Mara exploded out of the dark with a rope in one hand and marsh patience in the other. Timing. She caught the wrist of the nearest man as he reached for her, twisted him across her hip, and let his own weight drag him off balance. He hit the floor hard enough to slam the breath from his chest. The second man came in low, trying to shove her back toward the wall. Mara stepped with him, not away, and turned his push into a stumble. The board under his heel skidded in the old damp. That was all she needed. She hooked his ankle with the rope, snapped it tight, and sent him down face first into the plank floor. His nose cracked with a wet sound that made the old man swear. The lantern rolled under the table and threw light in a useless ring. Smoke curled up from the spilled oil, sharp and black. Mara saw the third man in the doorway now, the one with the careful steps, and he had a baton in one hand and a pistol in the other, a hired one, maybe the one who had said her name. He fired once. The shot buried itself in the wall where her head had been a heartbeat earlier. Mara dropped flat, rolled, and came up on the far side of the table with her back low. The man in the doorway tried to track her, but the room was too cramped, and his angle was wrong. That was the other thing Silas taught her. Weapons love distance. Rooms like this belong to whoever keeps moving. She kicked the table leg hard. It slid an inch, then another, and the man in the doorway had to shift to keep his balance. Mara used that half step of hesitation to drive the rope up and around his wrist, then yank. The baton flew from his hand. He lurched forward, slammed into the frame, and she struck once at the side of his knee with the heel of her palm. Not enough to break it, enough to make him fold. By the time he hit the floor, the older voice had gone quiet. Mara looked up. The man she'd heard from inside the shed was standing near the back wall now, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, coat dark with rain. He had not rushed her. That told her everything. He had been waiting for the others to fail. His eyes moved over her once, quick and exact, and there was no surprise in them, only recognition. "You're quick," he said. "Wrong room," Mara answered. He gave a small nod, almost polite. Then he lifted one hand, and from behind the side door came the scrape of more boots on wood. At least 2, maybe 3, so the room had never been the whole trap. It had just been the part she could see. Mara shifted 1 foot back and felt the floor give a fraction. The boards over the sump were thinner than the rest, a weakness, the kind a marsh trapper notices once and never forgets. The older man's mouth tightened when he saw her glance drop. He knew, too. Outside, the foghorn from the canal blew once, long and low, and somewhere beyond the shed, a wagon wheel rolled through mud with a heavy sucking sound. More men arriving. Or leaving, hard to tell. Mara kept the rope in her hand and let her face go blank. She was no longer the girl they had tried to corner at the office. She was the thing the marsh made when you pushed it too far. And when the side door finally slammed open, the first man through it looked down at the loose planks under her boots and froze just long enough for her to smile. The man in the doorway never got his full step. Mara let the loose board give just enough to steal his balance, then snapped the rope up under his ankle. He lurched forward, caught the frame with one hand, and the old floor answered with a small groan that felt too loud in the close air. The weight of him pulled the weakness open. One heel vanished between the planks, and the next thing he knew, he was biting the inside of his cheek while the floor tried to swallow his leg. That was the kind of ground Silas loved, a promise. The second man came in behind him, baton raised, and Mara drove her shoulder into the trapped man's ribs before he could recover. The impact turned the first man sideways and blocked the doorway just long enough. She slipped low, hooked the baton arm with the rope, and yanked hard. The weapon clattered across the boards and skidded under the table. The older man at the back swore and started for her, but the room was so tight that every move cost him speed. She took one sharp step back, let him commit, and slammed the edge of her palm into his throat. He staggered, not down, just enough. Mara moved through the shed like she already knew where every weak board and blind corner lived. Not graceful, exact. She was hunting the spaces between men more than the men themselves. The one at the doorway tried to drag his trapped leg free. Mara didn't let him. She crouched, seized the rope near his boot, and twisted. The man gave a raw, wet shout as the angle of his own weight bit into the board. Then she saw it, lying half-hidden behind the dropped lantern. A wax packet stamped with the canal seal, fresh as the morning office papers. She snatched it one-handed, not even slowing. Inside the packet were 2 things, a folded schedule and a note with a time on it. Dawn. The older man saw her reading it and went still. That was his mistake. Stillness in a room this tight was just another way of telling her he was worried. "Get her," he snapped to the man at the door. But by then the plan had already shifted. The shed was no longer the trap. It was the place where she had learned their route, their clock, and the direction of their next move. She slid under the table, kicked once at the sump board, and felt it sink a hair deeper. Good. The pit was still open. The old drainage channel beneath the floor ran out toward the marsh ditch behind the shed. Someone had used it before. Someone with city hands and a marsh problem. Listen close now, because this is the turn where the whole hunt starts changing shape. Mara didn't wait to be boxed in. She dropped into the sump channel, dragged the rope after her, and let the darkness close over her shoulders like cold water. Above her, boots slammed the boards. One man shouted that she'd gone under the floor. Another said to light the ditch. Then the older voice came, low and rough, and it was closer than before. "Don't lose her," he said. "We need her on the flats before first light." Mara froze in the black water channel, one hand on the rope, the schedule pressed flat against her ribs. First light meant the bog road, the flats, the place where the city ended and the ground stopped pretending to be solid. She started moving again, silent as a reed bending in wind, and just as she reached the outlet grating at the back of the shed, she heard her own name spoken outside, right over the drain opening, by a voice she had not expected to hear this close. The drain outlet coughed her out into a ditch full of dead reeds and black water. Mara stayed low, one hand on the rope, the other flat in the mud so she could feel the ground before she trusted it. Behind her, the shed door slammed again and voices rose, muffled by boards and distance. Above the ditch line, a lantern glow started to move in short jerks, searching. She didn't look back. A man's voice came from the outlet behind her, quiet and tight. "That way's dead. Take the reed cut." It was the clerk. Not brave enough to matter, not stupid enough to stay inside. He had a city coat pulled over his shirt now, and his face was pale under the smoke, but his eyes kept flicking toward the road like he expected to be caught speaking. He didn't step out. He just pushed a folded strip of paper through the drain bars and pulled his hand back fast. Mara caught it before the water took it. On the strip were 3 words and a sketch of the flats. West ditch, early mud, burn line. That was all. It was enough. Mara moved through the wet edge of the city while the men behind her started turning the marsh into a road. They thought the reeds would slow her. They didn't understand that the reeds were home to her. Every bend, every soft patch, every place the mud held water wrong, she could read it in the dark. The reed cut was a narrow path between broken fence posts and collapsed drainage stone. On her left, the tannery district breathed its stink over the flats, all soot and boiling hide. On her right, the marsh opened low and flat under the fog, a place where the water hid under skin-thin ice and waited for boots to get stupid. White stakes had been driven along the edge in a crude line, the same markers she had seen from the wagon road. The men were building a corridor through the dangerous ground. She smiled once, thin as a knife edge, because she understood the shape of their fear now. They weren't trying to find her. They were trying to push her where they thought the ground would finish the job. Mara took the clerk's paper, tore it once, and used the strip to retie a marker stake at a wrong angle. Then she crouched and checked the mud around the post. One print, wide boot, deep heel. The canal warden style, or someone who wanted to look like him. She traced the print line with her eyes until it vanished into a patch of marsh grass bent in the wrong direction. There, a second route. She followed it without stepping where they wanted her to step. 3 times she crossed the soft edge by laying her weight across roots and old plank scrap half buried in the mud. Once she paused with one boot over a black patch that looked solid and let a bubble rise under it before she moved on. That was the sort of thing Silas had taught her before she could tie her own laces. The ground tells you the truth if you stand still long enough to hear it. Up ahead, beyond a line of reeds, she caught the shine of another lantern, then another. Men were spreading out at the flats now, not all at once, trying to circle wide and keep each other in sight. Mara dropped into a hollow and watched them pass. 4 shapes, maybe 5, rope over one shoulder, hooks in a crate, and at the back, the warden in his brown coat, moving slow and certain as if he had already counted her corners. Then she heard it again, her name, carried low across the water, spoken like a man who expected to be obeyed. Mara held her breath, turned her head just enough to catch the shape of the voice through the fog, and saw a lantern swing toward the ditch she was hiding in. The light stopped on the mud beside her knee, and beside that light, in the black water, she saw one set of fresh footprints that had not been there a second ago. Mara kept still while the lantern searched the ditch, and the second set of footprints settled the question for her. One pair was heavy and wide, the kind left by a man who didn't trust the ground and hated that he had to. The other was lighter, placed carefully on the edge of the black water, almost like someone who knew the marsh well enough to walk it without wasting motion. Not city boots, not dock work. Those prints had grown out of the reeds. She slid one hand into the mud and felt the hidden board under the waterline. Someone had laid a narrow plank bridge across the ditch, then covered it with reeds and muck. Smart. Ugly, too. The sort of trick that only works on people who rush. Mara moved one boot onto the root mat and let the rest of her weight hang back until the wet board gave a soft, trapped creak. That sound carried through her chest like a warning from home. A young woman raised by a near-silent marsh trapper in a frozen lake and reed wilderness, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice craft off other people, stood on the edge of the flats and read the ground the way other people read a face. The marsh was full of lies, but it told on itself if you watched the shine of water and the bend of grass. The voice came again from the reeds ahead, lower now. "You're late." Mara did not answer. She shifted left, then right, testing the soft crust, and found the narrow ridge that held her weight. The ditch opened into a broad strip of dead ground between the city road and the marsh proper, where old drainage stone had collapsed years ago and never been fixed. A place built for sinking, a place where men with tools and plans would feel brave for exactly 1 minute too long. At the far end of the strip, someone had lit a lantern under a sack to dim it, not to hide the light, to hide the direction of it. She could see the shape of a man moving beside it, one shoulder turned in that familiar, careful way. The clerk from the canal office. He looked wrong in the open air, too thin for the cold, too scared to be standing there. When he saw her notice him, he lifted one hand and pointed once toward the marsh edge, then made a flat, slicing motion across his throat. Not a threat, a warning. He mouthed 3 words she couldn't quite hear, then pressed a folded scrap of paper between 2 reeds before backing away into the fog. Mara waited until he vanished, then pulled the paper free. It held a fresh sketch, better than the first one, with a line drawn through the flats and a mark on the far side of a half-collapsed pumping ditch. Under it, in a shaky hand, were the words, 2 teams, 1 warden, dawn after next, burn reeds first. So that was the real shape of it, not just a chase, a sweep. They meant to push her out of the cover, dry the marsh with fire if they had to, and force her onto the thin open skin where speed mattered more than footing. They were planning around her strength now, which meant they were finally afraid enough to think. Mara folded the note, tucked it into her sleeve, and turned toward the pumping ditch without looking back. The lantern behind her moved once, then stopped. A pair of boots shifted in the mud somewhere to her right. She let them think she was still deciding. By the time the first man stepped onto the narrow ridge after her, the line of reeds ahead was already marked in her head. Every sink patch, every hard root, every place the water sat under the crust too long. She waited until his second foot came down. Then the ground answered. Mara let the first man's boot commit, then watched the mud swallow half the toe before he felt it. He jerked back too late. The ridge under him held, but only just, and the whole line of reeds ahead trembled with the movement. That was enough to tell her the trap had more than one layer. Somebody had built the ground to look safe from one angle and hungry from the other. She backed off the narrow strip and slid along the ditch edge, keeping her weight on roots and stone. The fresh footprints she had seen were leading away from the lantern, not toward it. That meant the voice behind her was the bait, and the men ahead were the blade. Good. Let them think the marsh was only one thing at a time. It was better when they underestimated how many ways it could kill them. The smell changed first. Lamp oil, yes, but under it, something sharper. Burned reed fiber. Dry stalks stacked under canvas. She eased up behind a stand of willow scrub and saw the shape of it all at once. Bundled reeds, 2 tin jugs of kerosene, and a line of men working the far bank in pairs. Closing. They meant to light the edge and drive her toward the pumping ditch where the water ran shallow and the footing went bad. A fire on marsh ground. That was a purge. Mara stood in the dark and watched the city men turn the flats into a cage with fire on one side and mud on the other. She counted heads, 5 nearby, maybe more beyond the willows. The warden wasn't in front anymore. That told her he'd moved where he could see the whole shape of the sweep. Better and worse at once. Better because she knew where the leader would stand. Worse because it meant the plan had already started. Mara took a slow breath, then reached into the marsh grass and found what she wanted. A broken reed stem stiffened by frost, long enough to serve as a marker. She bent it twice and laid it across the path at shin height where one of the pair advancing on the left would have to clip it. Then she moved to the pumping ditch and pressed herself flat in the black water shadow. The first pair came through, one man with a kerosene jug, the other with a knife tucked under his coat. Their boots were careful now, but careful feet make noise in reeds. The man with the jug stepped over the marker and cleared it. The knife man didn't see it until his shin hit. He stumbled, cursed, and threw a hand out for balance. The hand landed on a rotten hummock that gave way under him. He went into the knee with a loud, wet crack of reeds. The kerosene jug slipped from his partner's grip and rolled downhill toward the ditch. Mara's hand shot out of the dark, caught the handle, and yanked it under the low willow roots before either man could grab for it. The first man spun, too fast, and Mara used his own momentum to slam his shoulder into the flooded edge. He went down hard, face first, into black water, and came up coughing reeds. The second man had the knife out now, but he had no room to use it. The ditch was too narrow, the bank too slick, and Mara was already past him, moving low and fast along the root line. He stabbed once at empty air. She hooked his wrist with the rope she still carried, turned his elbow in a single hard twist, and took the blade away like it belonged to her. Behind them, voices started shouting from the fire line. She heard the older one then, the patient voice from the shed, and it was closer than she liked. "She's here. Cut right. Don't let her reach the ditch outlet." So they had learned something. She had made them tighten up. Good. Tight men break easier than loose ones. Mara slipped the knife into her sleeve, moved one step higher onto the root mat, and looked past the reeds toward the far bank, where the first orange glow of struck tinder was beginning to wake in the fog. If they got that fire going, the marsh would turn into a black wall of smoke and panic. But she had seen the canvas stacks. She knew exactly where the dry reeds were piled, and when she reached for the next stem to bend it into a marker, her fingers touched something else hidden under the grass. A coil of wire. Not marsh wire, city wire, fresh, shiny, and tied to a short wooden peg, with her name scratched into the peg by a steady hand. Mara did not pull the peg out right away. She crouched in the wet grass with the city wire shining in her hand and let the marsh breathe around her for one long second. The name scratched into the wood had been cut by a steady hand, the kind that did not shake, not dock muscle, not some panicked boy. Somebody had taken time to mark her, then planted the piece where she would find it. That meant they wanted her reading the trap, not just crossing it. Mara sat in the dead reeds and understood the insult in that little peg. It was a city trick, dressed as marsh-craft, a bait line with her own name on it. The kind of thing men do when they think they've finally learned the language of a place they still don't understand. She slipped the wire free and followed it instead of the footprints. It led her not toward the fire line, but along the edge of a sunken drainage path where the ground dipped twice before rising to the pumping ditch. The wire had been tied to short stakes hidden under reed mats, all of them spaced just enough apart to mark a corridor through the wet. Not for her, for men carrying fuel. Mara moved low and careful, one hand brushing the tops of the grass so she could feel where the wet changed to firm. Ahead, the first orange glow had started to leak through the fog. Dry reeds stacked under canvas, 2 jugs of lamp oil, a strip of burlap wrapped around a bundle of resin-soaked kindling. They meant to make a wall of flame and smoke. No, worse, they meant to make the marsh run. She tasted tannery-smog carried on the wind, old leather and ash folding together with the bitter green stink of swamp water. The first worker at the fire stack bent to strike a match, and Mara saw the shape of his shoulders before he saw her. He wasn't a dock man. He was smaller, younger, with a city coat pulled tight against the damp. A runner, the kind sent ahead so the men behind can blame him if things go bad. Mara let him light the tinder. Then she moved. The hidden drainage trench beside the stack had a crust of mud over black water. She stomped once on the near edge, just enough to crack the skin, and the wet ground gave a groan under the fire pile. The runner jumped back, and that was all she needed. She snatched the burlap bundle by the charred edge and hauled it sideways into the ditch. The kindling hissed as the mud swallowed its heat. One jug tipped, oil spread in a bright, stinking sheet, and vanished under the water before the flame could catch. A shout went up from the reeds. Another man answered, then another. More boots, more panic. Mara stayed low and let them come to the wrong place. The first man hit the drainage path at a trot, carrying a hook pole. He expected a girl running. He got a snare line across his knees and fell hard enough to crack his chin on stone. The second man tried to jump the trench and landed where the bank had been cut away from under the grass. He slid into the black water with a thud and came up spluttering, both hands clawing at reeds that tore loose like rotten rope. This was the old lesson, not strength, timing. Give the ground a little help, and it did the rest. Mara dragged the city wire tight between two half-hidden stakes and fixed it low across the path where the next pair would have to step. When they hit it, one went down knee first and the other stumbled into him, both of them folding in the mud in a tangle of boots and curses. The wire sang once under strain, and the sound set a chill up her arm. Not because it was loud, because she knew someone had tied it there to find her, and now she had tied it to catch them instead. Then she heard the clerk's voice from beyond the reeds. "Mara, don't go to the ditch outlet." He was close, too close. His breath sounded ragged, and behind it she caught another sound, heavier, patient, moving with no rush at all. A man in a brown coat stepped into the fog behind the clerk, and the clerk flinched like he'd been struck. Mara saw the shape of the coat before the face, and her stomach went cold, because that was not a dockman. That was the older voice from the shed, and in his hand, hanging loose at his side, was a lantern turned low so the light would not betray him. The lantern in the brown coat kept coming forward, slow and low, and Mara stayed pressed into the reeds until she could read the man's feet. He did not hurry. That was worse. Men who hurry make mistakes. Men who know the ground wait until it has nowhere left to hide. He stopped 3 paces from the ditch and lifted the lantern just enough to catch the bent wire she had found. His face was half lost in fog, but she saw the mouth move into something like a smile. "Smart to keep reading it," he said. "Not smart enough." Mara heard the tone and knew at once that this was not a dockman playing at marsh work. This one had learned the shape of fear from the top down. He was no runner. He was the one who told runners where to stand. She rose just enough to see him properly. Brown coat, good cloth under the mud, brass whistle on a chain at his throat. The same sort of signal piece she had seen on the wagon rail, only newer, brighter, expensive enough to be a promise. He held his lantern with one hand and a short-bladed knife with the other, though he wasn't pointing either at her yet. He wanted the knife to matter more if he had to use it. Behind him, the clerk hovered at the edge of the reeds, white-faced and shaking. Mara caught one glance from him and knew he had been forced into this part. His hands were empty. His eyes were not. "Back off," the brown coat told him, without looking away from Mara. The clerk did. Mara looked down at the wire in the grass, then at the peg with her name. City wire, city hands. That meant the trap was meant to be found by her, not sprung on the men carrying fuel. Somebody had wanted to corner her into believing she'd outplayed the whole thing. It was a neat lie, almost pretty. She dropped her weight onto the root mat and moved first. The reed stalks hissed as she crossed them, and the brown coat man snapped the lantern toward the sound too late. Mara caught the lantern wrist with both hands, drove it down into the mud, and the glass exploded in a flare of wet light. He cursed and jerked back, but she was already inside his reach, shoulder low, boot planted on the soft bank where his weight would slip if he chased. He swung the knife anyway. A bad swing. Angry, not clean. She tilted one step aside and let the blade cut nothing. Then she rammed her elbow into his forearm and the knife clattered into the wet grass. The clerk made a sound in his throat, half gasp, half prayer. The brown coat man tried to recover his balance on the ditch edge, but Mara had already seen the weak place. She hooked his ankle with the city wire and pulled. He went down hard to one knee, then both, hands slapping into black water. The brass whistle swung free against his throat. The chain flashed once in the dim. He reached for it with panic, and she caught the chain before his fingers did. That was when she saw the second detail that mattered. The whistle wasn't a signal for the men behind her. It was a signal for the men coming in from the road. Far off, beyond the reeds, a vehicle engine coughed to life in the damp. Not close, but moving. The brown-coat man saw her face change and smile through the mud. "They're already on the flats," he said. "You're late to your own flood." He had said flood, not fire, not sweep. Flood. Mara yanked the whistle chain tight until his own coat collar bit into his throat, then leaned close enough to smell the tannery-smog on him, mixed with bog rot and lamp oil. "How many?" she asked. He laughed instead of answering, which was answer enough. She let go of the chain and stepped back as the first orange glow went up behind the reeds. Not one fire. 2, separate stacks, one near the dry canvas, one farther out by the pumping ditch. The men had split the burn line after all, and now the wind was pushing smoke sideways across the flats in a low, dirty sheet. It would blind the marsh in minutes. Mara bent, snatched up the fallen knife, and looked once toward the road where the engine sound had gotten louder. Then she looked at the brown coat man still kneeling in the mud, one hand to his throat, and saw something in his sleeve she had missed before. A second mark. Not a seal. A map stitch. The same one she had seen in the office, except this one pointed not to the flats, but deeper into the marsh, toward an old culvert she had never shown anyone. And from inside the reeds ahead, where there should have been only water and grass, she heard a soft, metallic click, like a latch being lifted. Mara, raised by a near-silent marsh trapper in a frozen lake and reed wilderness, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice survival craft off other people, takes a night job in a smog-choked tannery city. When the brothers who run the canal docks corner her on an iced weir, expecting easy prey, and end up broken, their crew opens a hunt that she finally turns by drawing them out onto the rotten bog ice that swallows the careless. Mara went flat in the reeds as the latch clicked again, and this time she knew the sound had not come from the open marsh. It had come from below. Somewhere under the grass, under the black water skin, a hidden door had shifted on old metal. The kind of door you only hear if you've slept next to ice and listened for cracks all your life. She eased the wire off the peg with 2 fingers and felt the tension in it. Fresh city wire, fresh work. Her name scratched into the wood was not a threat anymore. It was a marker for a route someone expected her to take. That meant the culvert the brown coat man had pointed toward was real, and the noise in the reeds ahead was not a mistake. It was movement around a thing they had buried and hoped she'd find. Mara knelt in the mud and listened while the marsh tried to tell her who was lying. Above the hiss of the wind, she caught the thin rattle of lamp glass, the low click of boots against stone, and then that patient voice from the shed again, calm as a priest and twice as dirty. "Burn line's failing," it said. "Pull back to the culvert." So that was the shape of it. A fire meant to herd the other men into the culvert mouth. The traps were layered now. One for her, one for the runners. one for anyone foolish enough to think the marsh only had one face. Mara moved in a crawl along the ditch edge, keeping low enough that the reeds brushed her cheeks and left wet streaks across her skin. Ahead, the first glow had turned ugly, orange and thick, reflecting off smoke that had started to pool over the flats. The tan smoke stink of the city was mixing with burning reed and turning the air sour. She could see men crossing between the stacks in short, hard runs now, not confident anymore. Fire changes a crowd. It strips the talk away. One of them stumbled near the pumping ditch and shouted for help. Mara saw the man's shoulder twist, saw the wire she had not laid but had nearly stepped over. Another line, another trap. She cut left and came up behind him with her rope already in hand. He turned at the wrong moment and caught the loop across the throat instead of the chest. Mara yanked once, hard, and drove him backward into the mud. His boots kicked wildly for a second, then lost the fight with the wet ground. She didn't finish him. She didn't need to. Instead, she followed the line of his fall to the bank and found the culvert cover half hidden under reeds and boards. Old stone, new hinges, fresh scrape marks. Something had been opened from the inside not long ago. She crouched, touched the edge with her knuckle, and felt the cold draft breathing up through the crack. Not an exit, a throat. The brown coat man was somewhere near here, and so was the voice that had not hurried once. Mara straightened just enough to see the fog beyond the culvert mouth, and there, inside the opening, a lantern lowered to ankle height, moving toward her like a slow eye. Then the voice from inside said, very softly, "She's here." And from the black mouth of the culvert, someone answered in a voice Mara knew from home, a voice she had not heard in years, calling her by the name only one person was supposed to use. Mara did not answer the voice. She stayed where she was, one hand on the wet reed mat, the other around the city knife she had taken from the brown coat man. The culvert mouth breathed cold air at her face, stale and old, carrying a smell that did not belong in the marsh. Rusted stone, dead water, oil trapped under rock. The voice had used the home name cleanly, too cleanly, and that was what warned her. In the marsh, a real voice carried small hesitations, the little scrape of breath, the wet pause between words. This one had none of that. It had been shaped to sound like memory. So she listened instead of stepping. Mara knew better than to move for a voice just because it wore the shape of home. She waited until the reeds around her stopped trembling, then eased her weight around the culvert lip and looked down into the dark throat beneath the boardwalk. The passage under the marsh was not natural. Fresh planks had been nailed into the sides to keep the mud from caving. City work, clean cuts on old stone. The kind done by men who expected to return later and did not want the tunnel to swallow their boots. A narrow lantern glow moved somewhere deeper in the dark, but not in a straight line. It was being carried below ground, around a bend. That meant the culvert opened into a chamber. Mara slid one foot forward, then the other, and lowered herself into the opening with her back against the stone. The walls were slick. Cold water ran in threads along the mortar. 10 feet in, the passage widened into a low-maintenance room with an old pumping wheel bolted to one wall and a bundle of reeds stacked dry under canvas. The place should have been abandoned years ago. Instead, it was active. Someone had been sleeping here. Someone had been feeding it. The lantern glow came from a brass speaking tube fixed into the stone. Not magic, just a pipe. A city trick. Voices sent through metal can sound closer than they are, bigger than they are. She crouched beside it and understood at once why the call had felt wrong. The sound had been pushed through the tube from the far end of the culvert network, not spoken from the dark right in front of her. They had used the tunnel to make her think somebody from home was on the other side. And then she heard it again, faint this time, coming through the pipe in a roughened whisper. No, not her home voice. Close, but not right. The wrong man had learned the old word and was trying to wear it like a coat. She reached up and ripped the speaking tube loose from its bracket. The metal screeched softly in the stone room. Above her, somewhere in the marsh, a boot shifted, and a second later, a latch clicked shut. Mara froze. The maintenance room had another exit, a narrow crawl opening behind the pumping wheel, half hidden by wet canvas. She moved toward it on one knee and found a stack of soaked maps tied with string. The top one had the marsh edge drawn in red pencil. The route marked on it ran straight through the low flats, then cut toward a line she knew by heart, her home line. Her throat tightened once, but she didn't let it show on her face. She took the map, rolled it tight, and tucked it under her arm. Then the room went still, in the way only a hunted room can go still. It was waiting. From the crawl opening behind the pumping wheel came a sound she knew even better than the voice. A careful breath. Close enough now to feel. Mara turned, knife low, and saw a hand reach through the dark under the canvas. It wore a gray workman's cuff, soaked through at the wrist, and on the knuckles was fresh mud from the city road. The fingers closed around her ankle before she could pull back, and the grip was strong enough to drag. Mara kicked the ankle free and turned the man's grip into a wrenching drag. The hand on her leg slid across wet stone, and she drove the city knife down beside the wrist, hard enough to pin the sleeve to the floor. Not the flesh. The cloth. Enough to stop the pull. Enough to make him gasp. The hidden man came out a little more then, face still buried in dark, and she saw the gray cuff up close. Clerk's cloth. Cheap wool. Sweated through. He was not the threat. He was the thing being used up to make the threat easier to miss. Mara moved with the same hard patience she used on frozen water. She did not waste a cut. She did not waste a word. She pressed her boot on the man's sleeve, shoved his wrist into the stone, and waited until the rest of the room told her what mattered. The brass speaking tube on the wall gave a thin metallic whisper. Then the voice came through it again, farther now, roughened by distance and pipe. "Still thinking, Mara?" That one hit harder than any shove, because it wasn't the voice itself that mattered. It was the shape of it. A mouth pretending to belong to home. The kind of trick a man learns only after he has watched a place long enough to think he can borrow its ghosts. She looked through the crawl opening behind the pumping wheel and saw a narrow channel beyond, sloping up toward another maintenance chamber. City work, sure, but old enough that the stone had turned slick with years of seepage. The tunnel did not stop at the marsh. It reached under it. A hidden road under the flats, one she had never seen on any map. She understood the real design now. They were not only using the culvert to move men, they were using it to move a message past her, around her, under her. The clerk's face was pale in the dark. He whispered, "They said you'd come this way." Mara answered by hauling him upright by the collar and stuffing the map from the mud into his mouth long enough to make him shut it. Then she grabbed the speaking tube, wrenched it loose from its bracket, and let the pipe clang against stones so hard the sound ricocheted through the maintenance room like a warning shot. Somewhere beyond the opening, boots shifted and someone cursed. Good. The second chamber was lower than the first and smelled of rust, old water, and tannery-smog trapped in the stone. An old pumping wheel sat half submerged in black runoff, its iron spokes slick with slime. On the far wall, a fresh chalk arrow pointed toward a narrow slot cut into the foundation. An exit. Fast work. Newer than the rest. The kind of detail that meant somebody had walked this route more than once. Mara crossed the room low, one hand on the stone, and heard the clerk behind her make a broken sound that might have been relief or fear. In the slot at the far wall, she found a strip of leather tied to a nail. A signal strip. On it, a short note. House road clear after dusk. Use the east bank. Her stomach went cold. That was not for the docks. That was for her homeline. Outside, far off through the reeds, a motor coughed and settled into a hard idle, not near the culvert, closer to the marsh road that led where she had not let herself think about yet. She could hear it through the stone, a low mechanical pulse under the breathing of the mud. Mara pulled the leather strip free, folded it once, and slid it into her sleeve. Then she stepped into the exit slot and saw, just beyond the reeds, a pale ribbon of smoke rising from the east bank, like a finger pointing straight home. Mara snapped the ankle loose with a hard twist and drove the knife down into the sleeve, pinning cloth to stone instead of skin. The hand on her leg vanished into the dark with a wet curse. When she turned, she saw the clerk's face, gray and shaking, half caught in the opening like he'd been shoved there by a stronger man. He wasn't the one who mattered. He was the one being spent. "They made me use the tube," he whispered, swallowing air. "They said you'd come through here. Said the east bank was clear after dusk." His eyes flicked toward the culvert mouth, terrified of being seen speaking. Mara crouched low and kept her knife in hand. "Who said it?" The clerk licked his lips. "The man in the brown coat. He said the fire line was only to turn the runners, not you. He said if you took the wrong bank, you'd end up where the ground breaks." His voice cracked. "They've got reeds dipped. Oil on both sides." Mara listened to the clerk the way she listened to ice after a thaw. Every word had a weight. Every lie had a shape under it. He was afraid enough to tell the truth crookedly, and that was still truth. Mara took the map from her sleeve, folded it once, and shoved it back against his chest. "Then don't stand there." She pushed through the crawl opening and came up under the boardwalk with wet stone scraping her shoulders. Above, the marsh had gone orange in places. Smoke dragged low over the flats, thick with tannery stink and burnt reed. The east bank lay ahead in a pale ribbon of fog and firelight, and the obvious path to it was lined with fresh boards laid over black mud. She didn't take that path. She stepped off it, onto roots and half-buried stone, and moved where the ground still remembered being solid. The city men had made one mistake. They kept building their trap in straight lines. That never worked on marsh ground. She found the first line of fuel reed before she reached the fire, bundles tied low under canvas, the oil smell sharp enough to sting her nose. 2 men were working there in short, quick motions, trying to set the edge before the wind changed. One looked up and started to shout. Mara let him get one breath of sound out, then came in under his arm, hit him in the ribs with the heel of her palm, and sent him stumbling into the wet pile. He went down chest first, and the canvas split under his weight. The second man reached for a match. Mara crossed the distance in 2 silent steps and hooked his wrist with the rope. The match flared, dropped, and hissed out in the mud. He tried to drag back, but she had him by the wrist and the shoulder now, turning him in place, using the slick ground under him the way Silas had taught her to use ice under a stag, not to overpower, to redirect. The fuel spill should have caught. It didn't. The damp in the ditch swallowed the flame before it could take, and the man in her hands stared at the ruined tinder with a look of pure, helpless fury. Then the voice came again from the reeds, her own name, same shape, same borrowed warmth. Mara froze, just for a breath, and the man in her grip felt it. That was enough for him to twist free and run. She let him. The sound had come from deeper in the marsh this time, not through a tube, not through pipe metal. It had come from the east bank line itself, where the smoke thinned near the old road to her home. She moved that way fast, skimming over soft ground, and the smell changed again. Not just fire, wet wood, old ash, and under it, the thin, bitter odor of lamp oil soaked into fresh-cut reeds. When she broke through the last screen of marsh grass, she saw the house road through the haze, and on it, just beyond the first stone marker, a lamp was moving inside her home, slow, steady, and held by a hand she knew was not Silas's. Mara did not rush the house road. She stayed low behind the first stone marker and let the lamp move a little farther before she closed the distance. Whoever held it was not pacing like Silas. The steps were too even, too cautious, a man trying to copy stillness with his whole body. The smoke ribbon over the east bank had spread thinner now, dragged flat by the wind, and through it she could see the outline of the home roof as a dark wedge against the reeds. Her throat tightened once, then she swallowed it down. Mara moved along the edge of her own road, as if she were crossing enemy ground. That was the lesson of the night now. The marsh did not care whose house sat in it. If men came with lies and oil and wire, it became their country for as long as they stood in it. She found the first sign before she reached the door. Fresh mud on the threshold stone, a heel print stamped too deep. City leather. Beside it, a second mark, lighter, as if someone had been standing uncertainly after being dragged. She touched the mud with one finger and smelled lamp oil mixed with wet wool. Not fire. Not long ago. The front room was dark, but not empty. A thin line of light leaked from the cellar crack under the floorboard by the stove. Mara eased toward it and heard the smallest sound of metal on glass. A lamp being set down carefully. Then a voice, low and strained. "Don't move. Just wait." It was the clerk. He was inside her home. Mara pressed herself to the wall by the stove and looked across the room. The table stood where Silas always left it, but one chair had been pulled back from the wall and turned on an angle, facing the cellar board, as if someone had been asked to sit and refused. That meant somebody else was below. Not hidden. Waiting. The smell coming up through the crack was wrong, too. Wet canvas, old ashes, tannery-smog dragged all the way out here and trapped under the floorboards. She lifted the board with 2 fingers. The cellar below had been turned into a little command room. That was the only way to describe it. 1 lantern, 1 folding chair, a spread of maps on a crate, and a length of rope coiled beside the wine rack where Silas used to keep dried mushrooms. A city man sat on the floor with his back against the far wall, wrists tied, mouth bruised. The clerk. Alive, yes, but barely. Beside him stood the brown coat man, one shoulder turned, knife loose in his hand, and behind him, near the cellar steps, a second figure she had not seen in the marsh before. The brown coat man looked up first. He smiled like he had been expecting applause. "You took your time," he said. Mara stayed on the top step, knife low at her side. "You put a lantern in my house. We put a warning in your house." He nodded at the tied clerk. "This one wanted to warn you sooner. I let him." The clerk tried to speak and got only a breath. Mara saw the swollen mark on his cheek then, and the new cut at his wrist where rope had bitten too hard. He had been used, then brought here to be noticed. That was the shape of the entire night, men using men to steer her where they wanted. "What did you do with Silas?" she asked. The brown coat man's smile thinned. "Nothing I needed to do." That answer was worse than anything clear. She took 1 step down. The cellar air was colder than outside and smelled of stone, blood, and river mud. On the crate behind the brown coat man, half covered by a canvas rag, sat a heavy brass whistle chain and a folded map of the home grounds. The same home grounds she knew better than any face in the city. Then the second figure near the stairs shifted, and Mara caught the cuff at the wrist. Gray wool, wet sleeve, clerk's cloth. Not the clerk on the floor, another one. The man by the stairs lifted his head, and in the lantern light she finally saw the face she had heard through the speaking tube in the culvert. It was the one she had known from home, but older, hollowed out, and wearing somebody else's coat. Mara did not look at the face in the cellar until she had the knife in her hand and the stair behind her clear. The man at the steps wore a gray work coat and a hollowed-out face that might once have belonged to someone from the marsh edge, but time and bad choices had sanded the truth thin. He stood with his shoulders slightly turned, the way men do when they expect trouble but have already agreed to it. The lantern on the crate gave him a wet shine across one cheekbone. His eyes, though, his eyes were still the same. That was the worst part. Silas's voice used to tell her, quiet as snow on bark, that some people stop being themselves long before they die. They just keep the shell because it helps the world keep paying attention. Mara, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice craft off other people, stood at the bottom of her own cellar steps and saw the shape of a lie wearing a familiar face. The brown coat man shifted beside the crate, one hand still loose around the knife. "You know him," he said. "Good. Saves time." Mara took one slow breath through her nose. The cellar smelled of lamp oil, old earth, and the damp wool of city men who had been waiting in enclosed places too long. On the map spread over the crate, she saw not just the home roads, but the marsh culvert she had found earlier, the East Bank route, and a red mark drawn in a circle around the little rise behind the house where the old smoke pit sat. They knew the land, enough to scar it. "Who sent you?" she asked. The gray-coated man by the stairs laughed once, and the sound scraped her nerves raw because it had the right shape and the wrong soul. "You always ask that," he said, "even when the answer's standing in front of you." He stepped down one stair. Mara did not flinch. She shifted half a foot to the side instead, putting the cellar wall at her back and the crate between them. A simple move. In the marsh, the simple move keeps you alive. He noticed, and his mouth tightened, so he still read her the way a hunter reads a trail. That meant he expected fear to make her useful. The brown coat man tapped the brass whistle on the crate. "There's a clean way out," he said. "Come quiet, and the house stays standing." The gray-coated man shook his head. No. House goes either way. We just decide who's inside it." That was the moment Mara understood the shape of the room. It wasn't a meeting. It was a sorting place. Her home, the clerk, the map, the whistle, the false voice in the pipe. All of it had been arranged to move her to one end of the choice. Silas had called this kind of thing a snare with a story in it. Not to catch the feet first, to catch the mind. Mara reached down, not to her knife, but to the rope coil beside the old wine rack. She flicked it once, felt the braid bite her palm, and stepped toward the gray-coated man just enough to make him tense. He took the bait. One step, then another. The cellar board near the stove gave a tiny crack under his heel. Nothing much, nothing a city man would hear. But Mara heard it, and so did the house. The board had been weakened weeks ago by damp. She knew the spot because Silas had once used it to keep wild pigs from raiding the roots stored below. She shifted her weight onto the floorboard beside it, and when the gray-coated man lunged, his whole front foot punched straight through. He went down with a curse and slammed one hand into the crate to catch himself. The whistle jumped. The map slid. The brown-coat man lunged to help, and Mara snapped the rope up around his wrist before his knife could come free. She pivoted, used his forward speed against him, and turned him hard into the wall. Bone hit stone with a sound that made the clerk up above cry out. The gray-coated man was fighting his way out of the board hole when Mara saw it. Not on his wrist, not on his coat, but tucked inside his collar where the lantern couldn't quite reach. A seam stitch, the same little red thread mark she had seen on the map edge. Homework. Her line. Then, from above the cellar, there came a knock at the front door. 3 short raps. Certain. Close. And the voice on the other side said through the wood, in a tone she knew too well, "Mara, open up. It's me." Mara did not open the door. She stood inside the cellar with a knife low in her hand, listening to the 3 knocks fade into the wood above her. The voice on the other side had the right shape and the wrong breath. Not the pipe trick from the culvert, not the roughened whisper from the tunnel. This one carried cold air with it, as if it had crossed the marsh on foot and not through a mouth. She knew that cadence too well to mistake it now. Silas had always left a tiny pause before the last word, like he was measuring the ice under it. The gray-coated man at the stair saw her face change and went pale. "You know him," he said. "I know the difference," Mara answered. Mara, raised by a near-silent marsh trapper in a frozen lake and reed wilderness, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice craft off other people, lifted her chin toward the ceiling and called through the floorboards. "What did you tell me about water that sings?" No answer came at first. Then, from beyond the front door, a hoarse voice replied, "That it lies before it breaks." That was enough. The brown coat man swore and shoved for the stair. Mara stepped inside his reach instead of away from it, hooked his wrist with the rope, and drove him shoulder first into the crate of maps. Paper burst outward in a wet flutter, and the brass whistle chain snapped off the edge and clattered across the cellar stones. The gray-coated man tried to crawl toward the stairwell, but the weakened floorboard gave under his knee and dropped him half sideways into the hole he had made earlier. He grabbed for the wall, missed, and landed hard enough to knock the breath from him. The cellar had become too small for lies now. Mara crossed to the front of the room, snatched the lantern, and held it to the gray-coated man's face. The light showed the old marsh scars at his jawline, the little hook scar under his left eye, the same one she remembered from winter nets and split fish fingers. He had not been Silas, no, but he had been close enough to home once to know what to imitate. City coat over dead history. That was the shell the world had left him. "Where is he?" she asked. The man swallowed, and for 1 second his eyes slid toward the floorboard by the stove, not toward the stair, toward the hidden board. Mara saw it and felt the cellar turn inside her head. The smoke pit, the old passage. Silas had built something under the house long before she left, and these men had found it. "East Bank," the man said, "if he's still breathing." Above them, the front door opened a crack, and the cold air that slipped in smelled of wet reeds, tannery-smog, and blood on wool. Mara moved before the brown coat man could rise again. She kicked the lantern base toward him, sending flame across the floor, then ducked through the stove side and yanked the hidden board up with both hands. Under it was a narrow cut of earth, older than the cellar walls, and lined with stone that had been touched by human hands only long enough to keep it from collapsing. The tunnel sloped down toward the marsh edge. Fresh scrape marks ran along one side, and at the bottom of the marks she saw what made her throat tighten. Silas's knife notch. The one he always made on wood when he wanted her to find something fast. She had half a breath to take that in before the lantern behind her went out with a wet hiss and the cellar filled with the smell of spilled oil. Then, from the tunnel below the house, a second sound answered the door above. A familiar whistle, low and sharp, the one he used when he wanted her to come running. Mara did not open the front door. She listened to the knock fade, listened to the breath behind it, and knew at once that the man on the other side had borrowed Silas's voice the way a thief borrows a coat. Too smooth, too sure. Silas never wasted certainty. He left it in the air for the weather to finish. The whistle from the tunnel below answered once more, low and sharp, and that was the real sign. Mara, sworn to keep her snare-and-ice craft off other people, turned away from the door and went down into the hidden cut instead of giving the lie its meal. The tunnel was colder than the cellar, stone sweating under her palm. She found Silas at the far bend where the passage widened under the smoke pit, one ankle looped in wire, one shoulder braced against the wall. He was thinner than she remembered, beard gone gray at the edges, but the eyes were the same, clear, angry, alive. He lifted his head at the sound of her boots and tried for a grin that came out crooked. "Took you long enough," he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost not. "You're the one who called from underground." "Only because they made me." He jerked his chin toward the ceiling. "That voice at the door isn't mine. Browncoat's man has been practicing." He had barely finished when the tunnel shook with a hard udar from above. Dust sifted down from the stone seam. Mara looked back toward the cellar and saw the faint line of oil smoke drifting under the floorboard crack. The men above had started the fire pit again, to smoke them out of it. Same trick, different coat. Silas saw it too. "They know the house routes," he said. "They found the culvert map, then found me before I could break it. So they let you live. They needed a voice that could get you to hesitate." That was the part that made Mara's jaw go tight. Not the threat, the method. They had learned home well enough to use it as bait. She stepped to the pump wheel and put both hands on the iron spokes. The mechanism was old, but the stonework around it still ran to the marsh ditch behind the house. If she opened the wheel, the low chamber would take water fast. Silas saw what she was thinking and nodded once. "Do it," he said. "The culvert's theirs. Let the marsh have it back." She turned the wheel. At first it gave only a groan, then a deeper one. Then the black water started moving in hard, cold pulses through the channel under the floorboards. Upstairs, the brown coat man shouted something sharp and angry. Another voice answered. Boots scrambled across the cellar boards. Mara climbed back into the house room just as the first stream of marsh water pushed up through the hidden seam and broke into the floor, black and shining. The clerk was there, pale as paper, one hand still tied where the brown coat man had left him. He looked from Mara to Silas and understood enough to do one useful thing. He took the knife from the table, cut the last rope on the stair post, and stepped back. The cellar flooded in under the map crate. Not a flood to drown the house. Enough to make the boards float, enough to make men slip, enough to turn their neat lines into panic. The brown coat man lunged for the stair and found the floor gone under him. He went down to one knee, swore, and reached for the crate. Mara stepped in, hooked the brass whistle chain with her boot, and sent it skidding under the rising water. Silas came up behind her with a length of rope in both hands. They moved together then, no words needed. He caught the brown coat man around the waist and drove him sideways into the flooded boards, while Mara snatched the lantern and smashed it against the stove edge. Flame caught on the spilled oil in a bright, quick flash. Not a blaze, a hard warning. The other man at the stairs turned to flee and slipped into the wet half-hole Mara had made earlier, dropping hard enough to lose the breath from his chest. The man with the old face, the one who had worn Silas's shape, came out of the cellar mouth next, and for one instant he stared at Mara like a man seeing the marsh answer back. Then the pump wheel gave another groan, and the water rose over his boots. He backed up too fast, hit the stair rail, and the brown coat man shoved him by mistake. Both of them went down into the black surge, cursing, striking at each other, the whole neat underworld unraveling in the dark water they had trusted. By the time the last of them stumbled out into the reeds, the house was standing, the cellar was half swallowed, and the culvert behind it had gone silent, except for water moving through stone. Silas leaned on the stove and rubbed his wrist where the wire had cut him. Mara crossed to him, pulled the binding away, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The room smelled of smoke, wet wool, and the bitter iron taste of the pump. Then he glanced at the front door, where dawn was thinning the dark around the frame. "They'll come back?" he asked. Mara looked at the old whistle hanging on its nail, dripping marsh water onto the floorboard. "Only if they remember the way." What stayed after the flooding wasn't the damage. It was the little things, the whistle on its hook, the map spread open and softened at the edges, the first strip of pale light on the stove lid. A house can lose its quiet and still keep its name if someone lives long enough to light the fire again. The marsh was already breathing outside the door when Mara poured the kettle, and the steam rose straight up in the cold room like it knew where to go. If you want more stories where the dark gets answered on its own ground, stay close and subscribe.